Hey, welcome back, everybody. It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we are continuing Throne of Eldraine limited set review, this time with green. So we'll have gone through all the colors by the end of this video, and then we'll have two more left, one for all of the multicolor stuff, and then one for all of the artifacts and lands, and so on and so forth. If you haven't joined me yet, we're going to rank every green card in the set into categories, starting with the least playable, more situational cards, all the way up to the bombiest of the green bombs. And green has a lot of solid cards in this set and a lot of build around, so kind of excited. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, feel free to do that below. I won't stop you. Or go to Twitter, find us on Twitter, MTG_ManaRocks. All right, enough of that. Let's go ahead and kick things off. First category, as always, is the sideline cards. This is dedicated to cards that are either sideboard situational cards, build arounds, or just stone cold unplayables, which we haven't seen a lot of unplayables in this set, but a lot of build arounds, and we'll see a couple in green as well. First card, we've seen this one before. It was in, I believe, War of the Spark. Return to Nature, 1 in a green, common instant. Choose one, destroy an artifact, destroy an enchantment, exile target card from a graveyard. All of these modes can be relevant, but there's too much. Too often, this card will just be dead in your hand if you choose to mainboard it. Yes, there is a theme of artifacts and enchantments in the set, especially in blue-white, but I don't think this is going to be one of those sets where you're wanting to main deck your Naturalize. Keep this as a sideboard card, and when you bring it in, it'll be pretty decent, even though it's never better than just a straight-up 1-for-1, especially against equipment decks. This can be relevant, but for the most part, it's just a sideboard card, and I don't think we're going to be main decking Return to Nature. Fell the Pheasant is very similar. This is your traditional kill a flyer type card. It's 1 in a green. It's a common instant. It deals 5 damage to target creature with flying, and you create a food token. We'll see a lot of food floating around green. Green is the main color that can produce food, whereas I think black is the main color that you're going to want to be pairing with it to use that food. So green-black is going to be a very synergistic color pair. That being said, Fell the Pheasant is very situational. You don't just get the food. You can't just cast this and make food. You actually have to have a flying target. And yeah, this is going to kill that target, but it's still not better than a sideboard card. This is not a set where Plummet is a main deckable card. So bring it in when you see flyers that are worth killing and keep it on the sidelines otherwise. Trail of Crumbs is our first build around card here, and it's a pretty interesting one. It's 1 in a green, it's an uncommon enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a food token. So I imagine there are some decks where that alone would be playable if you have the really strong food payoffs that we'll see at the end of this video. It also says whenever you sacrifice a food, you may pay 1 mana, and if you do, you look at the top 2 cards of your library. You can reveal a permanent from among them, put it in your hand, and the other one goes to the bottom. So that's kind of cool, right? Every time you sack food, you can pay an additional mana to get one of the top 2 permanents of your library. So this is definitely a build around that incentivizes you to sacrifice food. Now, what I don't think you're supposed to be doing with food in the set, or at least I think the least efficient way to use your food is just to sacrifice it to gain life. But if you're looking for cards, if you're looking for creatures, then yeah, you can sacrifice your food and you can pay an additional mana to try and dig towards some sort of creature or maybe lands or something like that, since this can find any permanent. I think what you want to do is find some other way to sacrifice your food, since most of the creatures and most of the effects that use food can sacrifice food for some sort of extra benefit, and then you want to use that to trigger this. Note that it doesn't say you have to sacrifice the food with the food's own ability, you just have to sacrifice it. So you can use some other creature to sacrifice the food, and then you can trigger the Trail of Crumbs. This is actually really strong if you've got a lot of ways to make food, since it essentially turns all of your food into extra permanents, extra cards, right? If you have a lot of instants and sorceries in your deck, this loses a little bit of value, but it is a sweet build around. It comes with a food on its own, and it does seem like it could draw you 3 to 4 extra cards throughout the course of a game if you're really dedicated to drafting food cards. Edgewall Innkeeper, another sideboard card. Again, these aren't bad cards, the Trail of Crumbs and the Edgewalker Innkeeper. They're actually quite good, but they're sideline cards because they require you to have the sort of deck that makes them work. For instance, the Edgewall Innkeeper does nothing if you have no other adventure cards in your deck, but if you have a bunch of adventure cards in your deck, it's actually really good. It's a single green mana for a 1/1. It's an uncommon human peasant. Whenever you cast a creature spell that has an adventure, draw a card. Note that that doesn't mean that you have to cast the adventure half of it. You simply have to cast the creature, whether it's casting it from your hand or casting it from exile with the adventure ability, right? So you're drawing a card every time you cast a creature with an adventure, and that's actually really sweet, right? Now, the risk of running cards like this, these build-around cards, is that sometimes you cast all your adventures, and then you draw the Edgewall Innkeeper, and it looks kind of silly, right? 1 mana, 1/1 with essentially no abilities. But the upside is really, really high in that if you start the game with the Innkeeper, then you're incentivized to just cast all your adventure creatures as early as possible, and each of them cantrips, which is actually quite insane. If I don't know if there's going to be a full-on quote-unquote adventure deck, right? Green and white have a lot of payoffs for casting adventures, but the adventures themselves are sometimes mediocre, and the more powerful ones are going to be picked up really early. So I'm not 100% sure how often that deck is going to come together, but when you do move into that deck, this is going to be basically the key card you want. This and the green-white uncommon that we'll talk about next time. Alright, and that's it for sideboard cards. We can move right on into our filler cards. These are the ones that we're not super excited to play, but they make up our deck a decent amount of the time, even though we don't hope to take a high pick on them. Hopefully wheel them in the draft. First one is Wolf's Quarry. 4 green for a common sorcery. Create 3 1/1 green boar creature tokens with, when this creature dies, create a food token. So, overall, the entire effect of this card is 6 mana for 3 1/1s and 3 food over the course of however many turns it takes for those tokens to die, right? Now, 6 mana for 3 1/1s with no evasion, no abilities is an absolutely horrendous card. So we're not looking to play that. And 6 mana for 3 food is very, very dependent on what else you have going on, right? You need a way to use that food. Now, basically, I read this as 6 mana, chump your opponent's next 3 attacks and create 3 food. I don't really know if I feel like that's worth the mana cost here. It's just those 1/1s aren't going to impact the board as much as you want to with a 6 mana card. It's sorcery speed, so it's not like you can trick your opponent or anything. And that food has to be really, really good in order for you to want this. It is a very nice stabilizing card. It gives you 3 blockers. Each of the food will gain you 3 life if you need it to. So if you're just against the full-on beatdown, maybe this is the type of card you want to switch out for just like some 6-drop creature or something like that, since it can give you a lot of time and a lot of extra life and resources against an aggressive deck, but it's still a 6-drop, and it just doesn't seem like it's going to be that impressive. If you have food payoffs and your food payoffs are really good, then I would value this card a little bit higher, but I don't think I'm ever taking more of one of these for my draft deck. Wildwood Tracker is a single green mana. It's a 1/1 common elf warrior. When it attacks or blocks, if you control another non-human creature, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Yeah, I'm not super impressed by this card. I think it's fine, right? It can block as a 2/2, but only if you have another non-human on board. So by itself, it is a 1 mana 1/1, which is extremely bad. And at its best, it's a 2/2, right? It's not that significantly better than just like a vanilla 2/2. In fact, I would rather just have a 2 mana 2/2 than a Wildwood Tracker, since this is sometimes a 1 mana 1/1, which is horrendous. Does attack a little bit. Sometimes you curve this into a 2-drop non-human creature and you get to start attacking for 2, but again, I don't think that's like the be-all end-all if you get to start attacking with a 2/2 on turn 2. It's just okay, right? And it never gets better than that. It's not like it gets +1/+1 for each non-human. It's just a single +1/+1. You're capping out at a bear here, and a bear is not exactly something that I aspire my creatures to be. Tall as a Beanstalk is 4 and a green for a common aura. It enchants a creature, and that creature gets +3/+3. It has reach, and it's a giant in addition to its other types. So probably some sort of top-down design that gives us a playable but not great aura. There are a lot of good tempo cards in this set. Go look back at Blue. Blue had multiple bounce spells. Blue has 2 enchantments that take away abilities from creatures or tap them down or something like that. Not to mention that there's just good removal in black and red. So I don't think auras that just grant power and toughness are exactly where you want to be. The blowout potential is just way too high on a 4 mana enchantment. And it's not like you even get an exactly insane creature, right? You probably have the biggest creature on board, and it has reach, but reach doesn't really matter unless you're sitting here blocking. And are you really casting a 4 mana aura so that you can block better? Probably not, right? So I don't think we're going to be playing Tall as a Beanstalk, although +3/+3 is enough that I have to kind of respect the amount of power that this puts on board, even though I don't really respect the card. Spore Cap Spider is back, first reprint since like Conspiracy or something. It's 2 and a green for a 1/5 common spider. It has reach. You can play this card in your deck if you're worried about flyers. It's not impactful. Green wants to be the beatdown. Green does not want to sit on defense for too long, but green can also lose to a flurry of flyers if you don't deal with it. So Spore Cap Spider can kind of bridge that gap between offense and defense for you while just sitting there and locking up the board. Also, pretty decent against the aggressive decks. We saw in the red video that there are a lot of red creatures that just want to be attacking, and that's basically all they want to do. Spore Cap Spider can be a big stop sign for those decks, even though it's not the most impactful card in your green deck. Rosethorn Halberd is our green equipment at common for the set. It's a single green mana. It's a common equipment. When it enters the battlefield, attach it to target non-human creature you control, and the equipped creature gets +2/+1. The equip cost is 5, which really kills the card for me. So 1 mana to give something +2/+1. It's basically an aura that turns into equipment, right? And only for non-humans. I hate this non-human thing. You're just going to randomly have humans in your deck, although I don't think green has a lot of them, but it's still really annoying that it's here for flavor reasons. But anyway, the Halberd, I just don't think it's great. What I like about a lot of the other equipment in this cycle is that you can re-equip. I think the most expensive one we saw was like the Giant Skewer that was 3 to equip and gave +2/+1. This is 5 to re-equip. It's basically, again, paying 1 mana for an aura that gives +2/+1 is how I'm viewing this card. And then it sits there and sure, it gives you some sort of value when that creature dies, but that creature's going to die. And 5 to re-equip is just way too exorbitant. You don't get any sort of evasion. You don't get Death Touch, despite this being a Rosethorn Halberd. Or you don't get anything, really. You just get a slight power bump and an even slighter toughness bump. And that's it. 1 mana is not really worth that. 5 to equip is not worth that. Altogether, I don't think this card is really cutting it. Although, it does add a little bit of power. It gives you a little bit of value. And a mana sink, even though it's a very exorbitant mana sink. So sure, it's playable. It's just not good. Marrowleaf Rider is 1 in a green for a 3/1 Elf Knight at common. You may sacrifice a food and target creature blocks it this turn if able. So this card's interesting. 2 mana 3/1. We've seen one in white. We've seen one in red. I think we saw one in black. I think every color except blue has a 2 mana 3/1 in this set, which is really interesting. The effect here can be powerful, right? You can see some situations where you sacrifice like 4 food and just force all your opponent's creatures to block this and then you kill them. But it's not really great unless you're doing exactly that. Now, if you want to be a beatdown, 2 mana 3/1s are probably what you're looking for. I've said it with every other 3/1 we've talked about. That gets punished by 1/1s. It gets punished by cards like Spore Cap Spider or any of these dirty 1 toughness or 1 power creatures that are floating around just sitting there blocking. So I don't expect the Marrowleaf Rider to be great, and I think green just has better beaters, but it does have a little bit of potential, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a nod here. I don't think this is how you want to be sacrificing your food either. There are much better ways to use your food, but hey, this lets you trigger the trail breadcrumbs for less mana than paying the mana to sacrifice food. So I don't know, maybe there's something there, but this is not the food payoff I'm looking for. Garenbrig Squire is 1 in a green for a 2/2. It's a common human soldier. So again, another bear with a little bit of upside. Whenever you cast a creature spell that has an adventure, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. I really, really wish this was like an uncommon and it got a counter whenever you cast an adventure, but we'll see that card in green-white. And that is what I'm really looking for. This, as it is, it's a bear. It can tussle. It gets a little bit better. It makes the combat trick side of a lot of the adventures a little bit better, since it essentially gives them an additional +1/+1, but those cards aren't amazing to start with, and giving them a tiny little extra power and toughness bump doesn't make them significantly better. This card seems weak to me. I don't know how often you're going to be adventuring in this set, but for the most part, if this gets an extra power and toughness bump like 1 or 2 times, I don't think that's really that much better than some other average creature you could be putting in this spot. So pretty dead average card. If you're not adventuring, it's extremely bad. I guess not extremely, that's an exaggeration. It's just not great. And when you are adventuring, it's not like it gets that much better. Garenbrig Carver. Garenbrig just giving us all of their weakest people. It's 3 and a green for a 3/2 common human warrior. Now, that's an unplayable card by these days standards. Like, I already hate the 3 mana 3/2 with no abilities. The 4 mana 3/2 is not really something I'm looking for. Obviously, you're overpaying for the creature because you get the benefit of having this adventure attached to it. Shield's Might, instant, target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. That's a fine combat trick. 2 mana, +2/+2 is not anything to write home about. It will help you in combat. I'm pretty sure we saw something like this in red, but it gave +2/+0. I think that dwarf gave +2/+0. And, that wasn't amazing. +2/+2 is certainly better. And then being able to cast a creature later on is fine. But the creature is not going to be the most impactful thing in the world, nor is the pump spell. I think together they come together to make a playable, fine card, but not anything you're super excited about. Obviously, if you have any of the adventure payoffs, then sure, you'll take a Garenbrig Carver a little bit higher than just another average creature because you just want a mass of adventures, but that doesn't necessarily make the adventure better. It just makes the card that you're adventuring for better, and I think the Carver can fill that role while not being an exceptional card on its own. Curious Pair is 1 and a green for a 1/3 common human peasant. It has an adventure. For a single green, create a food token. This is actually a nice little gap, a nice little way to bridge the gap between food and adventures, right? It's an adventure that makes food. So 2 mechanics on the same card, not something they do very often. And a 2 mana 1/3 is at least something, right? It's a blocker against aggressive decks, even though it's not an aggressive creature. It's not super strong on its own. I think this is fine. I think you're going to want food in your food decks, and you'll take basically any card that says the word food on it. And the fact that you're not paying much of a premium here is fine. I don't think we would pay a single green mana to make a food token. If that was just a card on its own, I don't think that would quite cut it. But I think having a creature attached to this, which is also an adventure for your adventure payoff cards, is pretty nice. And I think there are multiple decks that are going to be vying for this card, while also noting that it can stabilize you pretty early on against some of the 2/2s and 3/1s and stuff like that floating around this format. Once Upon a Time is up next. It is a highly talked about card for Constructed, and I think it's going to be amazing in Constructed, but at its best, it's just going to be a fine playable card in Limited. Nothing broken, but also not a card that is exceptionally bad. It's 1 and a green. It's an instant, it's a rare, and it lets you look at the top 5 cards of your library, reveal a creature or land, put it in your hand, the rest go to the bottom, right? So you're just digging 5 deep for a creature or land. It's got a little bit of a bonus benefit. It says, if this spell is the first spell you've cast this game, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. That's not exactly card advantage. You still lose the Once Upon a Time, even if you're casting it for free, and you just filter it into a land or creature. It does let you keep slightly riskier hands, since there's probably a land in your top 5 or a creature in your top 5 if you keep a land heavy hand, and that's kind of cool. It doesn't really matter when you cast this spell as long as it's the first spell you cast. So you're allowed to go to your draw step, draw your card for turn, and then cast Once Upon a Time for free, having a little bit more information, right? It's not like you have to cast this card in your upkeep before your turn begins or some stupid nonsense like that. It's fine, right? If this was just 2 mana, it didn't have the first spell clause on it, it would be a playable card, but the type of thing that I cut very often from my decks because they're almost do-nothing cards. They don't advance the board at all. They just dig you towards stuff that do advance the board, but at the cost of tempo and mana. So yeah, this is a fine playable card. Don't let its applications in Constructed lead you to believe that it's much stronger than that in Limited, even though it's worth money. You can play this card, but it's never going to be super powerful. It doesn't really do anything on its own. It's only as good as the rest of the cards in your library. All right, moving into solid playable territory. These are cards that I'm actually starting to get a little bit excited about putting in my deck. These are the beaters. These are the, getting close to cards that can win the game but need a little bit of work to do so. First one is Tuinvale Treefolk. It's 5 and a green for a 6/5 vanilla Treefolk. It's a common. Whatever. Like, there aren't a lot of huge high power and toughness creatures outside of green in this format, so even though this isn't Colossal Dreadmaw, this isn't Vorst Claw or anything like that, I think a 6/5 beater is going to be fine in this format. The reason I give it a solid playable, even though I would normally give a 6 mana 6/5 vanilla a filler category rating, is that it does have an adventure attached to it. Oaken Boon is 2 and a green. It's a sorcery. Put 2+1/+1 counters on target creature. I always view that sort of effect as kind of like an aura, but the fact that this is a quote-unquote aura that then turns into a 6/5 a couple turns later seems pretty strong to me, right? You don't care too much if your sorcery here gets blown out by a combat trick or gets blown out by a removal spell or something, because you didn't completely lose the card, right? You still have access to the Tree Folk later on. There's a minor theme of certain cards caring about +1/+1 counters. There's only like 1 or 2 in the set, actually. It's not even a full-on theme, but this card gets better with those. Overall, it's a fine card. You're not looking to jam a bunch of these in your deck, but if you're looking for adventures or you're looking for a good way to just curve out into a big creature, this will do the trick, even though it's not going to be the best card that you could get for that mana cost. Rosethorn Acolyte is 2 and a green for a common elf druid. It's a 2/3 that taps for 1 mana of any color. That would already be a very playable card. You can use that to ramp, you can use that to mana fix, and it's not really asking that much of you other than that you're playing base green, right? The adventure actually probably won't come up too often, but it is a nice cheap way to trigger your adventure cards while giving you something. It's Seasonal Ritual. It's a single green mana, sorcery speed, add 1 mana of any color. So you're paying a green mana to get 1 mana of any color. You're not ramping, you're not doing anything special, you're just filtering a green mana into something else. So this is just an extra layer of mana fixing for you, right? The Rosethorn Acolyte will let you mana fix early on, turn your green mana into other colors so that you can cast your splash cards or potentially your other colored cards, while also giving you that same ability once it actually hits the battlefield. And it's got decent stats, right? 3 mana 2/3 is fine, especially against 3/1s and 2/2s floating around the format. It's going to engage in combat and be relevant. I think this card is actually kind of sweet, especially with Adamant being in the set and the triple color legends that are in the set. Obviously, this card is here to, again, kind of bridge a gap between multiple different keywords and different abilities in the set. It's an adventure on one half, so people who care about having adventures are going to want those, but it also really makes Adamant a lot easier to pull off, so people who are interested in Adamant in their base green decks are going to be interested in the Rosethorn Acolyte as well, while also just being a solid card while it's on board. Ramp and Fixin is not too bad on a 3 mana 2/3. Outmuscle, formerly known as Bear Suplex, is 3 and a green for a common sorcery. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, then it fights target creature you don't control. So we know that as Hunt the Weak. We've seen better fight spells, we've seen worse fight spells. Hunt the Weak is always a fine playable card. It is green's kind of like base common removal spell, and that's okay. But there's extra bonus that actually makes this card quite good. Adamant says if at least 3 green mana was spent to cast this spell, the creature you control gains indestructible until end of turn. So you can let it fight off death touchers that you otherwise normally wouldn't be able to, or you can keep it from dying to some sort of pump spell in response or something along those lines. Just a nice little bonus to make you feel safer about casting a 4 mana fight spell, which can be risky at sometimes. Everything I said about getting blown out in response to auras is true about fight spells, so be wary of when you cast your Outmuscle, and don't draft like 4 or 5 of these. It is very clunky. It does lose to bounce spells and removal in response, so pick your poison, choose your timing wisely on this card, and when you do, it should be pretty strong. Also note, the creature you target that you control is going to be indestructible until the end of the turn. So that doesn't just matter for the fight spell, it matters for the rest of the turn as well. So that creature can pretty freely engage in combat. Sometimes when you cast fight spells, you get to pick off an opponent's creature, but you then can't attack with your creature. Otherwise, it'll die to something else that blocks it because it already took damage that turn. Indestructible lets you kind of get around that downside. So nice little bonus there as well. Insatiable Appetite is 1 and a green for a common instant. It says you may sacrifice a food. If you do, target creature gets +5/+5 until end of turn. Otherwise, that creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. So what you're looking at is 2 mana for a Giant Growth, but as an additional cost, or rather, I should reword that. You may also sacrifice a food to give an additional +2/+2, which is kind of nice. So I misspoke there. This is actually not an additional cost. You don't have to sacrifice a food in order to cast the spell. You cast the spell, and then when it resolved, you get to choose whether or not you're going to sacrifice a food. So you don't have to make that choice up front, right? In fact, you're not supposed to, because your opponent will get to kind of react, right? If they kill your creature in response to the pump spell targeting it, then you don't sacrifice the food. But if you're going in for lethal or something like that, then yeah, you're going to sacrifice that food and get in +5/+5. Normally, a giant growth would be a little bit filler for me, especially a 2-mana giant growth, but the fact that this can give +5/+5 and is a way to sacrifice food for value, I think that's something, right? +5/+5 is not negligible. There's like double strikers and stuff floating around this set, so that could be just a game-winning play. That's a little situational. It's not going to come up every single time, but I am going to give this a nod towards the higher end of combat tricks in this set, just because +5/+5 can be a game-winning play. Sire Farron, the Henge Hammer, is green for a 2/2 uncommon human knight. It's a legendary. Whenever it attacks another target attacking creature, it gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is Sire Fenn's power. This is kind of a glorified bear. It does have a relevant ability, right? If it's attacking alongside another creature, it gives that other creature +2/+2. The problem, of course, being that Sire Fenn is probably not long for the world. Now, this is a card that you want to use your pump spells on, right? You want an Insatiable Appetite Sire Fenn, or Farron, I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing your name, and just get in there, right, for 1,000,000 damage. There was a card like this in Guilds of Ravnica, or Ravnica Allegiance, one of the Riot creatures, and that card was fine. This is much cheaper, but it is double green, and it's not exactly great on turn 2. It's not like you're going 1-drop into this on turn 2 and then attacking for 1,000,000 on turn 3. That's kind of like Magical Christmas Land. You should expect this card to come down later. You should expect to have to support it, right? If you are playing auras, if you are playing pump spells, if you are putting +1/+1 counters on things, this is probably the creature you want to put them on, and it does make it a lot better. So we have to acknowledge that sometimes this is a hard to cast bear, and that's not a good spot to be in, but we also have to acknowledge the upside of it being just a complete powerhouse sometimes. So that puts it right in the middle for me. Once and Future is weirdly named, and also 3 and a green. For an uncommon instant, return target card from your graveyard to your hand, put up to one other target card from your graveyard on top of your library, and then exile Once and Future. There's an adamant clause, and I think you really want the adamant clause for this card to be great. It says if at least 3 green mana was spent to cast the spell, instead return those cards to your hand and exile Once and Future. So what you're getting here is, without adamant, you're getting a regrowth, so a card back from your graveyard to your hand, and then you're also putting something on top to set up your next draw. You don't have to do that second part if there's nothing else you want to put on top, but then this is 4 mana to just regrowth, and that is not great. Even if you put a card on top, this is just a 1-for-1, right? You're not drawing that second card. However, with the Adamant, this actually becomes a 2-for-1, and a card that I'm actually pretty happy to play. I like Restock and Regenesis and these cards that give you back 2 cards from your graveyard. This isn't even just permanent. You can get any 2 cards back from your graveyard, so there are some removal-heavy decks where this is going to be just busted. You get back 2 removal spells and you start killing things again. It's an instant as well, so there's a little bit of a reaction time for you to kind of choose what you get, and you can set up your top card in worst-case scenario with just another beater. It's not a great card, right? You don't have to take a bunch of these, but it does have an effect on the game, and it is a 2-for-1 in green some amount of the time, which you just don't always get. I would basically never cast this card unless I knew the Adamant clause was going to happen, but if that's the case, and I'm guaranteed that I'm going to get the 2 cards back to my hand, then I think I'm pretty happy to play this. Kenrith's Transformation is our next one. It's 1 and a green for an uncommon aura. Enchants a creature when it enters the battlefield. When the Kenrith's Transformation enters the battlefield, draw a card. The enchanted creature loses all abilities, and it is a green elk with base power and toughness 3/3. All right, so if this didn't cantrip, we probably wouldn't be talking about it very much, since if you have to put this on an opponent's creature, it still gives them a 3/3, which is kind of like when you beast within them, or when you use incongruity on their creature, they just start beating you down with a 3/3 instead, right? What I think you want to do with this card is put it on one of your own creatures, on some small creature, and just start attacking with that. The fact that it cantrips means that it's kind of free to do that. And there's not a lot of downside to it, right? You don't want to put this on one of your good creatures, but if your opponent has something in the way, Sure, you can put this on it. You can downgrade a big flyer or something like that. You can basically use this in a flexible way on either yours or your opponent's creatures, although it's not great on your opponent's creatures. But it cantrips, and that makes this card a little bit more playable than it otherwise would be. And there are some times where you get to go one drop into Kenrith's Transformation on turn 2, cantrip, and then start attacking for 3. And that's actually not that bad because you're not down a card for the transformation. Flaxen Intruder is a single green mana for a 1/2. It's an uncommon human berserker. When it deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice it, and when you do, destroy target artifact or enchantment. Okay, so the adventure is clearly the part of this card that we want. Let's read that real quick. Welcome Home is 5 green for a sorcery. Create 3 2/2 bear creature tokens. Okay, 7 mana for 3 2/2s is fine, right? That's not exceptional, but it's fine. It actually gives you a nice stabilized board. It gives you relevant bodies as opposed to the 6 mana make 3 1/1s. And even though those creatures probably aren't attacking very much, 6 power and toughness for 7 mana, it does something even though it's not great. Without that, the Flaxen Intruder's pretty bad, right? Sure, there are artifacts and enchantments floating around, but we already talked about that with Return to Nature, that's more of a sideboard application, and on top of that, the Flaxen Intruder has to get in there and sacrifice itself to destroy anything. Your 1/2 is just, it's not dealing combat damage, right? How is that happening? So, I'm not in love with it. This is more against people who are just running out early artifacts and enchantments and they don't have the creatures to support it. Then that's, I guess, where the Flaxen Intruder is supposed to shine. But I think this is mostly one of those cards where you want the adventure half more than you want the creature half. And even then, it's a pretty expensive adventure. So not in love with it. Playable. If you are putting this card in your deck, you are treating it like it's a 7 mana card, not a 1 mana creature. All right, let's go ahead and move into our high power early pick cards. We've got a lot of big, beefy green creatures to talk about here. We'll start off with a common. It's Garenbrig Paladin. This is part of the cycle that gets a +1/+1 counter with Adamant. In this case, it's 4 and a green for a 4/4 common giant knight. If at least 3 mana was spent to cast it, it comes in with a +1/+1 counter on it. And its bonus ability is that it can't be blocked by creatures power 2 or less. So it's a big, beefy beater that can't be blocked by little beaters, which is kind of nice, right? Especially in green, where you might be able to ramp into this a turn earlier. And if you're ramping, you're probably fixing for that extra green mana as well. So you'll almost always be able to get the counter on this if you're ramping into it. And yeah, that's fine. 5 mana 5/5 that can't be blocked by small creatures is really nice. Your opponent can't just chump block with little tokens. They have to throw something real in front of this or double block. And double block in a 5/5 is not always easy either. If they have a 2/2 and a 3/3, they can't make that double block. So they're either taking 5 or they're chumping with a 3/3, which is not exactly great. It's a knight as well. Not that green cares much about the knights, but I believe the whole cycle is knights. So that's something worth noting. I think this card's fine. It's clearly not like something you want 4 or 5 of in your deck. You're not super excited to take it, but I think it's always going to have a profound effect on the game, and it's going to shut down some of your opponent's game plans if they're looking to block with like small blue walls and stuff like that. Fierce Witchstalker, that's a little bit more what I'm talking about. 2 green for a 4/4. It's a common wolf. So 4 mana 4/4 with trample. Very good. We see cards like this every now and then. The 4 mana 4/4 is a tried and true power toughness ratio to CMC, and it's almost always good. In this case, when it enters the battlefield, you create a food token. So not only are you getting an efficient body, but you're also making a food token, which is going to be relevant for other cards. Now note that the wolf itself doesn't have any way to use that food, but imagine playing this against an aggro deck. You just take a couple hits on turn 2 and 3, and then you stabilize with this thing. You've got a food there to gain back some of the life if you need to, and you're just not going to be able to get attacked for the next couple turns by any of the small creatures your opponent started out with. Very good card. Definitely better than Garenbrig Paladin as it comes down a turn earlier and gives you a positive upside. But I think these cards are comparable. You are looking for these sorts of creatures to curve into in your green deck, and these are going to be the best of the bunch when it comes to the cards that you're looking to take from the draft. Oakhame Adversary is 3 and a green for a 2/3 uncommon elf warrior. This is the green card in the cycle of cards that hates on its own color. In this case, the bonus you're getting here is that you can cast it for 2 less if your opponent controls a green permanent. So, big difference between a 4 mana 2/3 and a 2 mana 2/3. Either way, it has Death Touch, and when it deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Now, that's a potentially extremely powerful ability, right? Not something you normally see on green. That's usually a black or blue thing, right? Being able to deal damage and draw cards. If you're playing against a green deck and your opponent goes turn 1 or 2 green permanent and then you go turn 2 Okame Adversary, you're going to be threatening your opponent a lot. They're almost certainly going to have to trade off if they have any way to do it. This thing has Death Touch, and by turn 3, your opponent might have to double block with some really small creatures or something, so this might 2-for-1 them. And if they don't block, boom, get to draw cards. I think outside of a green mirror match, this card is still fine, but you need to support it. You need to find ways to get it into the red zone, whether that means using it to fight off your opponent's other spells or using pump spells to just get it in there. As it stands, 4 mana 2/3, your opponent's almost certainly just going to block it every single time, so use that to your advantage, and if they don't block it, it's kind of like the Audacious Thief thing, where you just get to spiral out of control and take advantage of the game. Not something you see in green very often. Keeper of Fables. This card seems like a slam dunk first pick. It's probably supposed to be in the next category, to be honest. 3 green for an uncommon 4/5 cap. That's it. It's a cap. Whenever one or more non-human creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. So you only get to draw 1, regardless of how many creatures deal damage, unless First Strike is involved. But if you can get even 1 creature into the red zone and hit your opponent, you get to draw a card. I don't know when green just decided to get all of this powerful recursive draw power, but I know it's creature-based, whatever. This card is very strong. First off, 5 mana 4/5 on stats alone is a playable card. Not super exciting, but when you give this recursive draw ability to green, they get to spiral out of control. Again, it's paired very nicely with blue or anything that's going to have evasive creatures, since a lot of times your green creatures are just going to get chumped or they're going to get blocked. But similar to what I just said with the Okame Adversary, if your opponent falls behind, if they can't deal with an invasive creature, you're just going to get this draw engine on board, and they're not going to be able to keep up with you. Plus, you're playing green, so you're just going to be slamming fatty after fatty after fatty. On second thought, we're giving this honorary mythic uncommon status for now until I see otherwise. I think this card is going to be absolutely busted. But yeah, take this one highly and look for ways to make sure your creatures can get in for combat damage. Giant Opportunity is 2 and a green. 3, 2, 1. Giant Opportunity is 2 and a green for an uncommon sorcery. It says you may sacrifice 2 foods. If you do, create a 7/7 green giant creature token. Otherwise, create 3 food tokens. Very interesting here. Again, sacrificing the foods is not a cost to cast the card. It's just something that you may do once the card resolves. Now, this is going to be one of 2 things. It's going to be 3 mana for a 7/7, which is absolutely absurd, or it's going to be 3 mana for 3 food tokens, which could be very good depending on what kind of payoffs you have for that. If you have a Bog Naughty or something like that, any of the cards that care about using the food, like the Wicked Wolf we'll see here in a minute, then this card I think is going to be playable on its own. Plus, if you happen to already have 2 foods on board, then this is just 3 mana 7/7, and as I just said, that's a very, very good rate if that's what you want to be using your food on. It's interesting that you get to make the decision based on whether you already have food or whether you need food for something else. It's uncommon for a reason, just the pure power level. I don't think you'll be able to turn 3 it very often. You would have to have the nut draw of 1 drop, make a food, 2 drop, make a food, and then turn 3 Giant Opportunity. But that can happen, so keep that in mind. As it stands, I think this card has the potential to just be very powerful. It's almost build-aroundy in its nature, but I think on its own, 3 mana for 3 food is going to be a playable card in this format. I can't really explain exactly why, but I think that's going to be kind of the baseline for a playable card that does nothing other than make food, and sometimes this makes a 7/7 instead. Beanstalk Giant. Speaking of 7/7s, this is 6 and a green for a star with power and toughness equal to the number of lands you control. So assuming you're casting this for 7 mana, it's going to be at minimum a 7/7, right? And then it gets bigger every time you hit a land drop. Sometimes you ramp into this and it's like a 5/5 or a 6/6, but it still stands that, it gets bigger every time you play an additional land. The real appeal of this card, other than just being like an expensive kind of vanilla beater, is the adventure, Fertile Footsteps. It's 2 and a green for a sorcery. Search your library for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So a grow from the ashes without kicker, if you will, or harrow. I don't know, however you want to describe that. It does not put the land into play tapped, so maybe that matters. A lot of times if you cast this on turn 3, that doesn't really matter whether the land comes in tapped or not. But this fixes you and it ramps you, and the ramp matters a lot when you know you have a 7 mana 7/7 sitting in your exile zone. Card is pretty sweet. I think this is going to be a card that gets snatched up very, very early because people love playing and splashing other colors. And the Fertile Footsteps lets you do that. Similar to the Rose Thorn Acolyte, this is another card that gives you access to mana fixing in green. So as with most sets, if you're looking to splash, then you're looking for some of these green cards to help you with that. And Beanstalk Giant is a little bit more than just a way to help splash. It's also sometimes a game ender, and I think that all ties up into a nice little high power package. Yorvo, Lord of Garenbrig, is our triple color noble. It's green, green, green for a 0/0. All right, moving on. No, it enters the battlefield with 4+1/+1 counters on it. It's a giant noble. It's a rare. So 3 mana, triple green for a 4/4. Okay, that's a nice starting point. If you can get that triple green early enough, at least by turn 4. It doesn't have to be turn 3. But if you can get it by turn 4, then Yorvo's going to be a pretty strong card on board. There is more, though. Whenever another green creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Yorvo. Then, if that creature's power is greater than Yorvo's power, put another +1/+1 counter on Yorvo. So, I don't think you're going to be playing a lot of creatures that are that much bigger than Yorvo, right? The first time you play a green creature, or the first time a green creature enters the battlefield, Yorvo is going to become a 5/5, and then the creature has to have 6 or more power in order for Yorvo to get another counter. Now, the cool thing is that Yorvo is going to get a counter regardless of what the power of the creature you played was. It just only gets the additional counter if that creature is then bigger than Yorvo, which is maybe going to happen once per game at best. Maybe you have Beanstalk Giants and 6/6s and stuff, then sure, something happens there. But Yorvo still gets counters regardless of how big the creatures are, as long as they're green creatures entering. And it starts off as a 3 mana 4/4, which is quite strong. By the time you get to attack with this, it's probably going to be a 5/5. It doesn't have trample, doesn't have vigilance, doesn't have any sort of bonus. It's just big. A lot of these green creatures are just big, and that's it. So you need to find ways to either give them trample or turn them into evasive threats or so on and so forth. Again, pair this with blue, give it flying, attack with that turtle that lets another creature be unblockable. I don't know. Find a way to make Yorvo bigger, and it'll be a solid card. As it is, it's just a huge beater, and I think that's already justifiably high power category card for the mana cost that you're paying for it. Wildborn Preserver. This is another creature that's just stats. That's it. It's a 1 and a green for a 2/2 rare elf archer. It has flash and reach. Okay, that can eat a 1/1 flyer, I guess. Flash is fine here. It's supposed to be a little bit cute with the other triggered ability we'll read in a second, but you're not often getting that off outside of Constructed. This is clearly aimed towards Constructed, but it says whenever another non-human creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay X mana. If you do, put X +1/+1 counters on Wildborn Preserver. I think people are immediately going to start thinking in their head that this card is going to get gigantic without actually doing any real math. They're going to think, oh, well, if I play a 4/4, then suddenly Wildborn Preserver, I'll pay 4 mana, and it'll become a 6/6. Like, no, that's not really how this is going to work out too often. You shouldn't play off curve to make your Wildborn Preserver better. You should play it in such a way that if you happen to play creatures and you have extra mana floating around, then sure, dump that mana into the Preserver and make the Preserver bigger. But don't wait 3 turns to play your 4/4 or something like that just so that you have extra mana to put counters on your Preserver. You should just pay all 4 of your mana and tap out to play your 4/4 on turn 4, and then just wait till you have extra mana floating around when creatures enter the battlefield to make your Preserver bigger. Again, this is similar to Yorvo. It's similar to Beanstalk Giant. It's just stats, right? Sure, it has reach, but we said that earlier. Do we really want to make giant creatures so that we can sit back on defense and stop our opponent from attacking with flyers? Sometimes, but not usually. The fact that it has flash doesn't really make that much of a difference. It's going to be extremely difficult. You need other flash creatures in order for this to come down, also flash in another creature, have extra mana to put extra counters on it, and then make that a profitable block somehow. But, it's a baseline flash bear, which is okay. It can get bigger, even though that will come up a lot less than I think people are anticipating it will, even in constructed. And all you get for that is a giant pile of stats, which is fine, right? This card is going to be okay, but I don't think it's ever going to be that busted. Lovestruck Beast. Hey, look, it's stats. This card is stats. Everything in green is stats. It's 2 and a green for a 5/5. It's a rare beast noble. It can't attack unless you control a 1/1 creature. Doesn't matter what that creature is, but you need a 1/1 floating around, whether that's a token, whether that's an actual creature card, who cares? What you get for that is a 3 mana 5/5, which is pretty gross, right? It's stats. You get a big creature. The last 4 cards we looked at were just pile of power and a pile of toughness. The neat thing about the Lovestruck Beast is that it can still block, right? So even if it's not attacking, it is a giant stop sign against aggressive decks. They're not getting through it, right? So it's going to be blocking all day, every day, until you find a 1/1 to put on board. And wouldn't you know, they built that into the card. So the adventure half is Heart's Desire. A single green mana for a sorcery. Create a 1/1 white human creature token. So Beauty and the Beast, if you will. This card has some really nuts curve out potential. Obviously, if you draw this anywhere within the first 2 turns, you can use Heart's Desire to get that 1/1 on board. You don't really care about that 1/1, you just need it to stick on board. And then you cast your Lovestruck Beast and you start attacking for 5 on turn 4, turn 5, turn 6. Later in the game, if you draw this, it's 4 mana to make a 1/1 and a 5/5, which is really strong. Your opponent, if they don't have removal for a 5/5, they're going to have to point it at a 1/1 token or a 1/1 creature, which probably feels really bad. So I love the flavor design of this card. I think it's very playable. What I don't think you should do is draft this card and then look for 1/1s in the draft pod. You should just look for things that make tokens and have that be sufficient, or have this be sufficient on its own. Even if you lose the 1/1 token from this card and you have no other way to make a 1/1, you've still got a 5/5 defender, which is going to hold down the ground for a pretty long time. So Lovestruck Beast is very strong. It's a little bit situational. It's not an absolute bomb, right? None of these green cards that just do power and toughness related things are giant bombs, but they're all good beaters, and you'll be happy to play basically any of them interchangeably. Gilded Goose. This is not stats. This is actual food. It's a green mana for a rare bird. It's a 0/2 with flying. Yes, get in there. Take that reach. When it enters the battlefield, create a food token. All right, I'm kind of already in there. A expendable creature that makes food. That could be playable. For 1 in a green, you can tap it and create a food token. I think, I might be wrong, but this is the only, or one of the only ways to recursively make food tokens. I can't think off the top of my head of another way to just generate food tokens over and over again with a single card. Gilded Goose does that, which is very, very powerful, right? Gilded Goose also says you may sacrifice a food to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So this can be used as ramp and fixing. I think you really want to use that food for your other cards. So this is more of a support card than it is a standalone card, even though you have the option to play this on turn 1 and then ramp into a 3-drop or 4-drop a turn early or something like that and just get way, way ahead. Even in the late game, this can just spit out extra food tokens. And if you don't have other ways to use food, this is still playable because it's basically 4 mana tap, gain 3 life, right? You can tap this to create a food for 2 mana. You can pay 2 mana to tap and sack that food to gain 3 life. And there's some decks that are just going to have a really tough time dealing with that. So very versatile what you can do with this card. And it all boils down to the fact that this is repeated food token generation, which could be absolutely nuts for some of your other food cards. So this is the card that you really want to pick up early, and then you look for your food payoffs, and you're actually really happy when it all comes together. All right, bomb. So we're done talking about stats, right? Maybe not. We're probably still talking about stats here. But moving into our bomb territory, let's start off with Wicked Wolf, which is stats with some nuance. It's 2 green for a 3/3 rare wolf, so a hill giant. When it enters the battlefield, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. Sacrifice a food, put a +1/+1 counter on Wicked Wolf. It gains indestructible till end of turn, and you tap it. So a lot going on here. This is kind of a riff off like Bristling Hydra that we had back in Kaladesh or whatever. Ether Revolt, who knows. So first off, 4 mana 3/3 that fights when it comes up into play is decent. Notice that this is not a it may fight. It fights up to 1. So if you target a creature and then your opponent uses a pump spell in response or something, you don't have the option to say, okay, I'm not going to fight, like you do with some of the other spells that say you may fight. So once you've chosen a creature, if you choose to target a creature, you are fighting that creature no matter what. Now, obviously, you can do the food thing in response to the fight. You can sacrifice the food in response to the target that you chose to fight, and then the wolf will be indestructible, so it's not going to die to that fight no matter what. It will get a +1/+1 counter as well, so it's actually going to deal more damage to that creature, and it taps, which is like our new regeneration, right? Indestructible plus tapping is basically what they want regeneration to be. This is the type of card that you're looking to use your food for. Similar to Bog Naughty, this is the top end of food, right? This is what you're looking to pile up a bunch of food for and then just have this absolutely nuts card that your opponent can't deal with. If they try to remove it with a removal spell, if they try to kill it, if they try to block it or attack, you just sacrifice a food, it lives, and it gets bigger, which is kind of nuts. I think this card is absolutely fantastic. By itself, even without food, it can be a 4 mana 3/3 that picks off a 2/2, and that's already a 2-for-1 by itself, and it's going to be a lot better than that on its own. If you have a food laying around when this creature enters the battlefield, then it can pick off up to a 4/4 without you losing anything, and that's also quite strong. So look for ways to create food when you have a Wicked Wolf. Again, even the cheap cards that just make food and do something very minor get a lot better when you have the food payoffs in your deck, and this card is already playable on its own without that. All right, one of the last cards we're going to talk about here is Return to the Wild Speaker. Return of the Wild Speaker. It's 4 and a green for a rare instant, and it lets you choose one. Either draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, or non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. So the reason I'm putting this in the first pick category is not because either mode is super strong. There are times where, if this was 5 mana and just the first mode and you had no creatures on board, it'd be an uncastable card. It wouldn't do anything. If this was 5 mana and just the second mode, we've seen that card with Overcome, Overrun, and even though those cards often win games, there are times where it's not great, and this is a worse version of that. It doesn't give trample, but I think the combined flexibility of the card does put this in the first pick territory. First off, the first ability is just a very powerful green draw spell. We've seen multiple 4-power, 5-power green creatures in this set, and Return of the Wild Speaker can let you draw up to 4 or 5 cards, maybe even more than that, assuming they're non-human. But there weren't a lot of green humans, if any, floating around this review, right? It's also instant, so that's instant speed draw spell. And, you might draw up to 6 or 7 cards with this, right? Even if you draw just, 3 cards, you have a 3/3 on board as your biggest non-human, then 5 mana instant speed draw 3 is something that green will be very happy to play. The second half, it doesn't give trample, Again, it's not Overcome, it's not Overrun, but it is an instant, right? Your opponent is not going to play around a rare +3/+3 to all of your creatures, and sometimes that's just going to kill them. And even the things it doesn't kill, like if it doesn't kill your opponent and they're just blocking profitably, you're just going to kill all the creatures that blocked, right? Maybe they don't die that turn, but all their creatures are dying, or all their blockers are dying. They're taking 6 or 9 damage from unblocked creatures, and then you should be in a pretty good position to just run them over the turn after. So this card gets a high rating on flexibility alone, with neither card being what I would consider a bomb, but the combined effect, the flexibility of the card giving it bomb territory. Maybe not bomb territory, but definitely first pick status. All right, bomb territory. Feastin' Troll King. 2 green, 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 green. Very prohibitive mana cost, but thank God, because this card is absurd. It's 7/6 Vigilance Trample. It's a rare Troll Noble. But 6 mana 7/6 Vigilance Trample. That's almost Gargo's territory with Trample on top of it, which is absurd, and it just plays offense and defense. I'm tired of these giant green creatures getting Vigilance. Like, when did that start happening? It means you can't attack them and they're just going to kill you, and this thing even has Trample, so you can't even chump block it. But when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, create 3 food tokens. So that kind of is important for the second half because it's going to come back from the battlefield. It says sacrifice 3 food tokens. I don't know why they choose food tokens and then sometimes foods. Sacrifice 3 foods, return Feasting Troll King from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate this ability only during your turn. I lied. They say food sometimes without saying food token because there are a couple cards in this set that are food without actually being tokens. But that's I digress. Back to the Troll King. So what you're doing is you're paying 6 mana for a 7/6 Vigilance Trample, and it gives you the resources on board to reanimate it one time when it goes to the graveyard, because it only makes the tokens if you cast it from your hand. So if you're sacrificing the food to put it on the battlefield from the graveyard, it actually won't trigger the first ability and give you more food. It's not like it just comes back over and over and over again. It comes back just once, but let's be honest, that's usually enough to probably just win the game, right? On its own, even if this didn't recur at all, if this was a vanilla Vigilance Trampler for 7/6 6-mana Vigilance Trampler, that would oftentimes just close out the game if you supported it in any way, shape, or form, right? Assuming your opponent's just not extremely far ahead of you, that's a very strong card. The fact that they have to kill this, otherwise they can't really attack into it, and they can't just sit there and block it forever. The fact that they have to kill it once and it's just going to come back at least a second time is kind of ridiculous. Plus, you might just have other food tokens floating around. If you can get 3 more food tokens on back, it can come back an additional time. So, Feast and Troll King, I don't think you even have to put work into this card. It's not like you first pick this and then you have to say, oh, I need to draft a bunch of food, because the Troll King will bring itself back once, and that's just going to be devastating enough. Probably green's best creature in the set by far if you can pull off the quad green. That is a little bit prohibitive, right? There are times you get to 6 mana, you don't have triple green, let alone quad green. So that is a deterrent, and it should be, rightfully so. But this card is hyper powerful, and it's going to be extremely powerful when it hits the board. The Great Henge is our green legendary artifact in the set, in the cycle of mythic artifacts. It's 7 green, 9 mana total for a legendary artifact. It costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Let's talk about that in a minute. The effect you get here is tap, add green, gain 2 life, plus whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. So this gives you everything. It gives you mana ramp. It gives you extra mana for your mana sinks or whatever. It gains you life. It draws you cards, and it makes your creatures bigger. Like, this does the works. It puts everything that you want onto the board all in one nice little package. The problem is getting it onto the battlefield. 9 mana is obviously way too much, but this is never going to cost 9 mana, or at least if you have any sort of board state where this card would even matter, it's not going to cost 9 mana. Now, let's think about this realistically. We want this to probably cost around 5 mana if we can, which means that we need to reduce the cost of it by 4, which means that we need to get a 4/4 on board. Well, this set has lots of 4/4s. We saw multiple 4 mana, 5 mana creatures that put 4/4s or 5/5s out on board. And let's just say, let's go lowball this. Let's say we have a 3/3 on board as our biggest creature, and that's a lowball. You're often going to have a bigger creature. Well, this would cost 6 mana, and at 6 mana, you start gaining 2 life every turn. You gain extra mana, you draw extra cards, and you get bigger creatures. For 6 mana, that's what this card gives you, and that seems extremely powerful, and that's the low ball scenario of our biggest creature being a 3/3 on board. Sometimes we have a 6/6 on board. This card costs 3 mana, and then we can actually play it and another creature in the same turn, and you're just going to win that game out of just sheer advantage of every resource you can think of, right? Bigger creatures, extra cards, life gain to offset whatever your opponent's doing to you, mana ramp to use those extra cards. It's very powerful if you can get it on the board. The trouble, of course, is getting it onto the board. Now, be realistic when you draft this card. You're not going to play this card on turn 4. You possibly can. I'm sure there's some way to go like 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, boom, Great Henge, gotcha. Turn 3 Yorvo or something into the Great Henge on turn 4 or something like that. I'm sure it can happen, but if you're being realistic, you should probably expect to drop this card on turn 6 or 7 and then start using it from there. But even in the late game, the fact that this gains life attached to it means that it can be a stabilizing card and that it's worth it. If you took the life gain off of it, but you left everything else intact, it would be a lot harder to justify playing this card. But the fact that it gains life means that you can fall a little bit behind and then stabilize, and then use this card to just pull yourself ahead. And it will do that when it hits the board. So I think, unlike the rest of the cycle, this card is just absolutely nuts in an average deck. You don't have to do a lot of support. Maybe Embercleave is the same, but the white one, I don't know. Maybe the whole cycle is busted. But the white and black one, or rather the blue and black ones, the Mirror and the Cauldron, seemed like it was a little bit too much work for what you get, and then you have to put in more work after it. In the case of the green one, you don't have to put that much work into it, and you get so much out of it when it's on board that it's just going to win the game. So Great Henge is a bomb in my eyes. I will wait to see until I see it on the battlefield, but it's a mythic, so hopefully we don't run into it too often. And then we have one more card to talk about here, Questing Beast. This is just, any human being could read this card and be like, yeah, this card's very powerful. It's 2 green. It's a 4/4 mythic legendary beast. As Vigilance, Death Touch, and Haste, like, okay, whatever. Haste and Vigilance on your green creature, go for it. Can't be blocked by creatures power 2 or less. Okay, so it has the Daunt ability as well. Combat damage that would be dealt by creatures you control can't be prevented. That probably doesn't matter. I don't think there's a fog in this set. There's only 1 protection creature, so that's more constructed than it is anything else here. And it says whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to target planeswalker that player controls. Again, that part probably doesn't matter. What we're looking at here is a pile of stats and keyword soup on a green creature. So if you ignore the last 2 abilities and you just see 4 mana, 4/4, Vigilance, Death Touch, Haste, can't be blocked by small creatures, pretty busted. This is going to come down, hit right away. It's going to play offense and defense, which is pretty crazy on a big Death Touch creature. It means, they can't just sit there and take it forever. We see this on the Feast and Troll King. There's all these stupid Vigilance creatures floating around in green. And it has haste. Like, it comes down and starts attacking right away. It's funny because they make cards like this that just have a million abilities, and you can just, cut abilities out and see how many abilities you have to take away before the card becomes mediocre, and you would have to take quite a bit off of this card for it to be anything less than just a first pick creature. Legendary doesn't matter, but it's a little weird that it's legendary. I think that's for flavor reasons, but anyway, easy first pick card, just a pile of abilities, pile of stats, which is a green's theme here, and that's going to go ahead and wrap it up for us. Green, you saw, is looking to beat down. It's got food and adventure payoffs, which a lot of the other colors don't. So if you are in a quote-unquote adventure deck, you're almost always going to be green. You've got big beaters. You've got late-game bombs. You've also got some mana ramp and mana fixin' floating around. Not a lot of it. There wasn't a ton of green mana fixin', but there was enough. And there's a little bit in the artifact section as well. So we'll see some 3-color decks, even though this is very easily a 2-color format, with green being the headliner of decks that are looking to splash. So that's going to go ahead and wrap it up for us here. All of the colored cards taken care of. We got 2 videos left, so stay tuned to the channel. Feel free to subscribe below if you're still listening at this point. Find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. All right, that's going to do it. My name's Timothy here with ManaRocks. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.